yeah, she left the house this morning. She goes, I'm probably going to turn the heat on before you get home tonight because I'm not doing this again. Right.
Kevin's gone, David's gone, and Jane got company. She had to go home.
Oh, my. Well, tell me how Scott's doing.
He's going to have a PET scan Friday to see if what they're
Everything
doing has helped.
has helped, yeah.
And then he has another treatment on that. So, but he doesn't have a lot of strength. He gets tired easily. He still has some pain, but he's moving around.
Yeah, that's good to hear, Pat.
For a good report, for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's you're waiting for that report when you get that. So, yeah. Well, Aubrey and Brenda, you had Zach with you this past week. I saw you. So he was in. Yeah. Was Nick here the weekend before? Okay. Yeah, that's when I was gone. Did you get to meet Tilly? Yes. Yeah. Oh, he likes his job? Zach does? Oh, good for him. Well, that makes the rest of his senior year pretty easy, right? When you know you have a job, then you can relax. Yeah. Good for him. Good for him. Yeah. Well, we'll wait a few minutes. I'll tell you what, the dinner crowd's hurting our Bible study crowd. We had better crowds, people staying there. I'm going to mention a couple things to you on forgiveness if you're interested. This one book, I might recommend just ask Linda to look at it for the library. It's called Forgive for Good. The author is Fred Luskin. The book's 20 years old, almost 20 years old now, but I think it's still really a powerful book. He created a forgiveness center at Stanford University out in California. I don't know that he's a religious person. There's not, although there's some, on the backside, Rabbi Kushner's on here, and Lewis Smedes, a Christian theologian. But he really talks about forgiveness as something that we should do as human beings for ourselves. He doesn't go to it from a God perspective, but he's got some good ideas to help us be in the practice of forgiveness. So this is one book I want to mention. The other book I may have mentioned on Sunday before, Bishop Desmond Tutu, used to be the Archbishop of South Africa. His book, No Future Without Forgiveness, is another good book. And it's primarily about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that they had in South Africa after apartheid. And I'll mention a couple things tonight about this, but this is just a powerful book. If you don't know much about the history of apartheid in South Africa and what happened and how they should have come out of it, this book will tell you about that. And it talks about from the hope of trying to use Christian forgiveness to bring healing to a nation. So that's the second book I'll recommend.
Was he in prison?
Tutu was not imprisoned. Mandela was imprisoned. Yeah, Mandela was in prison for 30 years or more. Tutu kind of he was outspoken, but he was also a clergy in the Church of England. And so he kind of had some protection that way. The South African government didn't want to touch him because they didn't want England to be mad at him. So, Mandela didn't have that piece of it. So tonight we're going to look at a couple of passages from Matthew and then talk about the second step of forgiveness. I mentioned that I'm going to do a series kind of in three steps, and last week the step was remembering, and that oftentimes we use the phrase that to forgive and forget. Just forget what's happened and then you forgive. But the reality is that, it's almost nearly impossible to forget, right? When someone has really hurt you. So the key really is to try to work on remembering. And so we talked about that last week, that remembering, and try to remember more than just the hurt you received. So tonight I want to talk about this second step, which I think really is about healing. And kind of then next week we'll talk about the actual forgiveness. When do you decide to do it? So let's look in Matthew, first in chapter 6, and then we'll look in chapter 18 where we have the famous parable that kind of expands on the ideas that are in these verses, the first of which comes in the Lord's Prayer. So Matthew chapter 6, we'll read verse 12 and then skip to 14 and 15. And forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. So here we have this verse in the Lord's Prayer, and then a commentary about that just 2 verses later, in which it seems like Jesus is saying, if you don't forgive, don't expect God to forgive you. And Jesus then expands on this idea with his parable of the unforgiving servant. So that's in Matthew 18. Jimmy and Ann, we just looked at the couple verses from the Lord's Prayer, chapter 6, verse 12, and then 14 and 15. And now we'll go to, Jay? So Baptists and Methodists almost always say trespasses, and Presbyterians say debt. And the joke is because Presbyterians have more money. Yeah, exactly. So I don't, and the truth, it may have been in the way that a couple of English translations translated this verse from Matthew. So, but I'm not sure, Jay. But yeah, that was our joke. That those Presbyterians always has more money, so that say debt. So, of course, you'd think the Episcopalians are supposed to have even more money, but I think Episcopalians don't want to say trespasses. So, all right. So Matthew chapter 18 is the parable, and we talked about this parable in the spring, but that's been ages ago. So beginning with verse 23, Matthew 18, beginning in 23. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the Lord of the slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out of the building, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay me what you owe." And then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused, and he went and threw him into prison until he could pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all the debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" In anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he could pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So this passage, you can see, really, this parable really expands on what Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer and just after it. This idea that if you're not going to forgive others, don't expect God to be coming forgiving you. So I'm wondering to you in this parable, what stands out to you in the story of this parable? What are some things that come out to you that stand out? Say that again, Jay, louder. Yes, how could he repay him if he's in prison? So the unforgiving servant throws the servant who owes him just a little bit of money. How can he pay him? He throws him in prison. How can he repay him if he's in prison? He can't earn any money, right? Yeah. What else stands out to you in the story?
Well, the margin between the different debts. The first servant had apparently owed I forgot how much you told us that was, but it was a huge amount.
Yes, it was a lifetime. In fact, it's an amount so big that really there's no way it could have happened, you know. And so when Jesus told the story, everybody was like, "Oh, that's an unpayable debt," you know.
And then the other guy just owed a small.
Right. It wasn't insignificant, but it wasn't huge. Yep. What else stands out to you? So we're going to come back to those amounts in a little bit, and I think, and to what Jay said, because one of the things that I'm going to talk about is when we're trying to forgive and work through our own minds to forgive somebody, one of the things that we oftentimes do is we create these grievance stories, and we have these unenforceable rules that we hold people up to certain standards. And it's like this story. The man, unforgiving servant, throws this guy into prison and expects him in prison to pay him off. It's unenforceable, not going to happen. And his anger to do this is not going to help him out. If he wants his money, it's not going to help him out. Anything else that stood out to you in the story, the parable? Well, what about this idea about God's not going to forgive you unless you forgive your fellow person? What about that idea? Doug, you pointed at me.
It's almost paradoxical. It's like God's going to forgive you, but here he is, he's not going to.
Yeah, that's one of the verses I wish Jesus hadn't said. Jesus is always saying, he's always saying stuff I don't like all the time. This is one of those, you know. That to me it's hard. I think it's a hard saying of Jesus, because I don't want my forgiveness from God to be contingent on me being forgiven, because I know I can hold grudges. you know, I don't want God to hold a grudge against me. So, you know, I'll say the punchline with that. But anybody else have a problem with that? Do you find that a hard saying from Jesus?
Sometimes it takes time to forgive.
Yes.
You may not have that time.
Right. Yep. I think you're right, Jimmy. And I think that's one of the things in these 3 weeks I've said it's going to take time to do that. With when you're really hurt. Now, if somebody, I mentioned last week, if somebody over here in the table spills their tea on you and gets it on your pants leg, you know, you'll probably say, they'll say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and you'll say, "That's okay, I forgive you." But it's not a big deal. You'll just get those pants cleaned and whatever. But when somebody deeply hurts you, you can't just immediately say, "Oh, I forgive you." You've got to work through that.
Well, you look at the tragedies in life about people whose children have been shot and killed. And just recently I saw where a gentleman, they convicted and he said, "I'm sorry, I hope you can forgive me." And the mother says, "It's not me you need to be asking forgiveness from. You need to be asking God."
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
Which her thing is, I haven't forgiven you.
Right. And then I'm going to share a story. We know those stories. I mentioned last week, you know, some of the persons at the Emmanuel AME Zion Church in Charleston, South Carolina, who were able to forgive, who said, "I forgive you," to Dylan Roof. But the forgiveness did not mean, "Oh, you shouldn't go to prison," you know.
Right. And I think like Jimmy
Right, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So how do you work on forgiveness so that you can have healing within yourself? And that's one of the things that when we forgive other people, we're the bigger beneficiaries. I know it. We think it. We're giving somebody else a clean slate. We've forgiven them, but we're also giving ourselves a clean slate. We're also deciding, I'm not going to be angry anymore. I'm not going to be bitter about this. I'm not going to let this take an emotional part of my life. By forgiving the person, I can let go of all that. So let me get my notes and let's talk about healing a little bit, and we'll keep coming back to these two stories from Jesus. So the second step of forgiveness is really working on healing your pain. When somebody hurts you deeply, you've been hurt in some way. You've got some pain. Maybe it's physical pain. Maybe it's emotional pain. Maybe it's embarrassment, frustration. And Lewis Smedes, who is a great Christian theologian, wrote that forgiving must heal our pain before it can really do any good for us and the other person. So this part of what Jimmy said, it's going to take time. And one of those pieces of time is to work on your healing, to go to God, to talk things out. Last week I said it's okay to have a grievance story. When you're angry, you've been hurt, it's okay to have a grievance story. And I suggested there's some things you may want to do to relieve that anger. I mentioned one time when somebody had hurt me and I was so mad, I went out and took about 4 balls of tennis balls and went to a tennis court all by myself and just hit the tar out of those tennis balls. In about an hour of doing that, I felt much better. And I could start work, had to get my anger out. So it's okay to have a grievance story, but you got to get the anger out. And you can't stay there. And so then you got to work on your healing. How do you heal your pain from this? And the first thing I think is to start telling yourself that you control your feelings. When someone's hurt you deeply, you're helpless in that moment. And sometimes you can be helpless longer. If you confided in a friend and then they betrayed you and told some other people, you were helpless to stop that. And this rumor that's now going out about you, you can't go to everybody and say, don't listen to that. It's out of your hands. You're helpless. You're powerless in that situation. People who have received some kind of domestic abuse or some other attack, in that moment they were helpless and may feel helpless for a while because of that, because they were a victim and may go through a cycle of, why couldn't I stop that? So when someone hurts you, there's a sense of helplessness that we feel. And one of the ways to begin our healing is to tell yourself, I control my feelings. This thing that happened to me, this thing somebody did to me, I couldn't control that. And I can't control them today, but I can control my feelings. And it may be nothing other than, at start, I'm going to stop hating them. I'm going to stop being angry about this. I'm going to start giving this to God. And so when you begin taking control of your feelings, it begins to give you some sense of empowerment. The circumstances that happen to us do not have to define our lives. That is really one of the maturing things of life that we have to teach our children and that we have to learn ourselves. The things that happen to us do not have to define our lives. We choose how we will respond even to the terrible things that happen to us. So this first piece towards healing is to start taking control of our feelings. So the first challenge after that, I say, is challenging the unenforceable rules or the unrealistic expectations that we've placed on somebody. So we might demand that our spouses be faithful, that our bosses be truthful, that life be fair, right? And our children always obey us. We might demand those things in our house. But they're not going to happen all the time, are they? Maybe we're fortunate and Some of those things will happen. But life is not fair. And if we operate in our lives with these unrealistic or unenforceable rules, we are going to find ourselves being tied up in knots, because the people we love, the people around us that we work with, they're going to disappoint us again and again and again. And we're going to build up that resentment. We're going to build up that anger about things. So Luskin, the Stanford guy, says that when we place unrealistic expectations on other people, and then they break those unenforceable rules, that we become like a police officer who is parked on the side of the road with his radar gun, and people drive by and they're speeding, and he writes them a ticket, but his car won't start. So he can't chase them down and give them the ticket. But he just stays there and keeps writing more tickets while he's in his police car. That's kind of what we do when we have these unenforceable rules for people, these unrealistic expectations. We get mad about it and we're giving out those tickets. You were late tonight. You lied to me. Why did you do that to me? I've told you before, stop doing that. We're just writing those tickets. But it's not doing anything. It's just piling up in a police car. So Luskin tells one story about a woman he calls Sarah, who was married to Jim. When they first married, they were all in love, as young couples are. Soon in their relationship, she notices that his occasional drinking becomes more of a habit. Before too long, it's clear that he has a drinking problem. That turns into a drug addiction. As you might imagine, he stays out late sometimes with his buddies drinking. He gets into his drug habit that he has problems controlling, and sometimes he's gone overnight. She doesn't know where he is. As you can imagine, a spouse would want that to stop. In this story, Sarah, who he talks about, is always on him about this. They have one child. She expects him just to snap out of this and make sure that he's there every night to be with her and their child. And again, he disappoints her. She builds up her resentment. He builds up his shame. He knows he's not being the type husband, father he should be, but he can't break his habit. He's gotten addicted. He can't do that. So she finally gets to a point where she is able to forgive her husband. She decides she's going to stop having this resentment, and she is going to forgive her husband. What do you think happens next? You're exactly right, Doug. And why do you say that? Right, and that some things by themselves, forgiveness was not enough. Yeah. And what happens is when she forgives him, she had this resentment all the time piling up. And when she forgave him, before they were divorced, she would blame him for her unhappiness. She wasn't taking control of her feelings. He was the problem. If it wasn't for him, if he would straighten out, she'd be happy. And when she finally realized he's an addict, he can't stop himself, I'm not going to expect him to stop being who he is right now, and I'm going to forgive him. When she did that, however, she gave herself some power, and she said, I deserve better than this. So it ended up, she gave him an ultimatum and says, I love you. I've never stopped loving you. But I deserve a life better than this, and our child deserves a life better than this. And she gave him an ultimatum, and she said, you're going to have to go to therapy, to rehab, and to come clean. And if you do that, I'll stand by you, and we'll keep on working this marriage. But if you will not do that for us, for yourself, then I'm going to leave you. And he refused to go into rehab, refused to do that, and her forgiveness prompted then their divorce, which then allowed her to get really healthy. Then she was able to say, it empowered her. I control my feelings. I deserve better than this. I'm not going to blame him anymore. I'm going to forgive him. I'm not going to resent him anymore. He and I will work out custody, but I will stop hating him for what he's doing to me. And then she got much healthier about future relationships. And she said, you know what? I'm only going to marry again if I have a husband that I can trust and rely on. And according to the story, it's a long time before she remarries. And it's part because forgiveness had empowered her to take control of her life. Now, Luskin didn't say this in the whole story, but he hinted that this actually also helped Jim as well. That he was blaming his wife because she was always on his case. She was always on his case about not being the husband he was supposed to be. And when she forgave him, even though they divorced, when she forgave him, he had to let go of his resentment. And then that was a step to help him to start to take the road to recovery. Now, I don't know, I think they printed it before the story ends. But that's kind of what forgiveness can do. Healing can do. It can give us our lives back, even if it doesn't make them what they were before. And I think that's one thing to remember. Forgiveness does not mean things are going to be like they were before. They can be good again, but they might be different than they were before. So I wanted to read one story on Luskin in 134. Have myself a note. This might have been. Here we go. So here's some of the common unenforceable rules that he lists. My partner always has to be faithful. And that doesn't necessarily mean an affair with somebody else. Sometimes it's our partner needs to come home from work at 5 o'clock. Or my partner needs to make sure that the food is cooked at the house when I get home, or whatever. That this is how these rules are. People must not lie to me. Life should be fair. People have to treat me with kindness in the way I want. My life should be easy. My past should have been different than it was. Well, you know, that one can never be changed, right? Your past can never change, right? So what he says is, these are the things we kind of tell ourselves. And when people disappoint us with these unrealistic expectations, these unenforceable rules, this resentment builds up. And he finally says, you just have to forgive people for this. People are not perfect. Life is not easy. And if you can forgive people and let them be fallible people, you still expect them to treat you right and say, this is how I expect you to treat me, but you don't hold it against them. It can change the relationship. Let me stop there. Any thoughts or comments about these unenforceable rules, these unrealistic expectations that we carry and let resentment build up? Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's just part of, maybe because of childhood, we think, because when you have good parents and they take care of you, you think, well, this should be always life, right? Should always be loved. I should always have somebody help me out. And that's not the way it goes. And so we have these unrealistic expectations sometimes in relationships.
I had this conversation this week with my 5-year-old grandson. He did not want to go to school.
Uh-huh.
So granddad and grandma was home. And
Yeah. You don't want to go to school if grandparents are here.
he could be a little obstinate, and he just kept saying, it's not fair. It's just not fair. And I said, Will, life, you're going to find out, son, life isn't fair in life, but you got to go with it, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was that teachable lesson that, and his mama calmed him down a lot. Told him a story about his dad at that age.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And that once you get to school, everything will be fine. You'll have your friends. And he had a great day. I mean, you know.
Yeah, good.
But it's true. We grow up, and even today, we're so self-centered.
Right.
everything to be our way,
Right.
and it's not.
Yeah. So it may be, Doug, it may be just part of human nature. You know, the terrible twos happen because, you know, when you're a toddler, you think the world revolves around you, right? And then all of a sudden, you're a little bit older and somebody, mom or dad or grandma or granddad, says no to you. And then the terrible twos come. That no, a no comes in.
We do learn it so early in life.
Yeah.
So it's amazing when you stop and think about a 2-year-old, how young they do. And you can go in the nursery and watch and you can get life story.
You're exactly right, Aubrey. Yeah. And so, yeah, so we carry this in our lives all the way up through us. Yeah, it never leaves us. We have to learn to realize life is not perfect. It's not going to be fair. Even our best friends and our closest family members are going to disappoint us. And part of the forgiving process is learning to accept them for who they are and not holding it against them. So the next thing he's talking about is, I would say about that piece, the one thing about, we can always wish for people to tell us the truth, and we can wish for people to be honest with us, but we can't expect it. We just know that that's not always going to happen. And that if we do expect that, what happens is it's like a wound. You never get the other day I was helping my daughter, Abby. She just moved in a new apartment. And I was helping her put together IKEA furniture. Anybody ever bought IKEA furniture? It's, you got to put it all together. And I got on one of their little screws, I got one of those little metal slivers in my thumb and couldn't get that little thing out. And of course, it just irritated. My thumb wasn't going to feel better until that came out. And so what happens is when we live by these unenforceable rules, we just keep that wound festering in our skin over and over again. You got to get it out before you can start healing. When you get it out, then you can start healing. So the first thing is challenge those unenforceable rules. The second thing is create a positive intention. Create a positive intention. Some of y'all may remember the Rolling Stones song, "You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find what you need, might get what you need," right? So try to work at, I don't get what I want, but is there a positive intention you can get to? And I love the story that Lusk makes in one of his stories. In this particular case, a gentleman named Andy. Andy can never do anything to gain the approval of his mother-in-law. And so every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Easter, when all the family's together, his mother-in-law just is on him and irritating him. Why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? My daughter deserves this, and he doesn't deserve that. Nobody wants that. And it used to make him so mad, and he would get in arguments with her. Well, how did his wife feel when he's having arguments with his mother-in-law? She feels awful. She's mad. She gets, why do you let her get to you like that? Don't let her do that to you. She's my mother. Please don't do that. So then the arguments that he was having with his mother-in-law, who was always for whatever reason, doesn't seem to like him, is always giving him grief, then becomes arguments between him and his wife. So he decides to shift his habits. And he's going to have a positive intention. And he is going to, out of love for his wife, whenever his mother-in-law just digs at him a little bit, he just lets it go off like water off a duck's back, right? Isn't that the old saying? And he's just going to let it roll off. He's not going to pay attention to it. He's going to pretend she didn't even say it. And Thanksgiving is more pleasant. Christmas is more pleasant. His wife is happier. The dread he used to have about making these family trips has stopped. Now it's more pleasant. And over time, his mother-in-law starts warming up to him. But it all changed not because he was going to first forgive his mother-in-law, as he was so mad at her and she didn't love him. He was going to change his behavior because of his love for his wife. So what can you figure out to do when someone has hurt you and you're not ready to forgive them, but you want to change your behavior? Can you figure out another positive intention that will help you do that? In Tutu's book, when he talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, that was the big thing. His title of his book, There's No Future Without Forgiveness, that was his saying for South Africa. If we can't forgive each other for all the terrible things that people did to each other during apartheid, most of it was white against black, but sometimes it was black against white in retaliation. If we can't forgive each other, he said, we cannot be a country, because there's too much hurt here, there's too much pain, there's too much suffering, and we have to forgive so that we can have a future. So it wasn't about, I'm going to forgive somebody for them. No, I'm going to forgive this person so that my children can live in a society that has a future. And because of their children and grandchildren, people of South Africa bought into this. And if you remember how that process worked, if you were accused of a crime, murdering somebody, doing something to somebody, if you were accused of a crime, you could be prosecuted. But if you would go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and tell the truth, the whole truth, your crime would be set aside and you would have no jail time. But you had to tell the truth, which meant if there was 4 people that murdered somebody and you told the truth, you had to say who the 3 people were. You couldn't hide anybody else. You had to come clean. And there were many people who didn't do it and they went on to prison. But if you had your chance, and Tutu's book is great because it has so many stories where people, one chapter is titled, I want to forgive, but I need to know who to forgive. You know, this person had lost a family member. They had been murdered during the stuff of apartheid, and this mother wanted to, first of all, know where her son was buried. And she did want to forgive the people because she said, I don't want to carry this in my heart anymore. So even if you can't forgive them right then, is there some other thing that will help you change your behavior? So for Andy in the story, it was his love for his wife. Tutu said in South Africa, people decided they would work towards forgiveness because they wanted to create a future for their children. The third thing I want to say is that forgiveness, I alluded to this earlier, forgiveness is empowering. And the act of forgiving somebody gives you your power back. As I mentioned earlier, when somebody hurts you, you are powerless. If you get fired at your company because someone betrayed you and lied about you and you got a bad report, you're out of a job. You are powerless to change that. So how can you get your power back? You get your power back by starting to work towards forgiveness, by starting to control your own feelings. And Tutu in his book talks about a family in Montana who were vacationing one weekend with their children. They were out in the woods, and they realized their youngest daughter was missing. And she was never found, and she had been kidnapped by somebody at the campgrounds. Parents' worst nightmare. And she's killed. This man kills her. And at his trial, the mother does 2 things. She first, and this is, of course, months and months and months after it happened, she did say she forgave him. And she said she forgave him because she said, I want to remember my daughter's happiness. And I can't do that if I don't forgive you. And then she spoke on his behalf at his sentencing and asked the judge not to give him the death penalty because she said, I don't want my daughter's name to be tied to this man's death. He's going to have to face God on his own terms. But I don't want my sweet daughter to be remembered with that man's death. And so here was this powerful story about this mother who forgives this person for doing the worst thing I think you could possibly do. But notice that she did it not for that man. She did it for herself and for her daughter's memory. And in the end, hopefully, it changed that man. But it was for her and her family, her peace of mind. The last thing I'll say is that we tend, when we get our feelings hurt, we have this grievance story. Somebody did something against us. I'm so mad at them. I'm angry at them. And that's okay to use that to get the anger out. But then you need to change that to a justice story. What's fair? And is it fair for you to want revenge on this person? Because revenge never gets fairness. Revenge just makes things worse over and over again. Revenge never makes things better. It only makes things worse. And so can you think about what is just and right and fair? And when you start doing that, you might find yourself backing off. What's fair in this instance? And that's another step towards leading to forgiveness. Last week, I mentioned that forgiveness, we hope, builds a bridge to reconciliation. But the reconciliation should not always happen. And Doug was alluding to it earlier. If there's somebody who sexually abuses a daughter, a girl, we hope for her sake one day she could forgive her abuser. But they probably should never be reconciled, at least not unsupervised. She needs to be safe for the rest of her life. So there's times reconciliation shouldn't happen. But most of the time, hopefully it does happen. But the only way reconciliation happens is when forgiveness is also paired with repentance. And sometimes we think, well, I want to forgive somebody, and that's it. But for the relationship to be reconciled, the other person needs to repent. And as you've heard from my 4 sermons on Book of Acts, repentance is changing direction. And that means you stop doing the things you did. And if there's going to be reconciliation, forgiveness has to be followed by repentance. All right, let me stop there for the night. Anybody have any last thoughts?
I think you've got, we talk about somebody doing something bad to us, but also the reverse, the counter it as, I do something bad that hurts somebody else, and I know I've hurt somebody else. I've got to learn to forgive myself.
Yep.
I've got to not only apologize to the person I hurt, I've got to own up to the facts. And it helps sometimes to talk it out with somebody.
Yeah. So next week we'll talk a little bit about forgiving yourself. Because next week we're going to talk about, okay, we've worked on remembering, we've worked on healing. Now the next step is actually doing the forgiving, saying the words, I forgive you. And one piece of that is learning to forgive yourself on the other side of that. So thank you all. Hope you have a good night.
Yeah.
in the morning when I rise. In the morning